We're not
Tim's thesis idea, and I hope I'm not, stealing some of your thunder, but Tim's thesis idea was a seed that was planted during a directed study with me this past summer, where I signed the novel Life of Pi, and it was in the context of a course on fantasy, new mythology, and magical realism, and the relationship between those three things. And something about the novel really spoke to Tim, and about the power of story. And so that's when we began to talk about the idea of him diving into that. So today, that's what you're going to hear about. Tim's thesis is called Fact from Fiction, New Mythology and Magical Realism in Life of Pi. So I'm really excited to be here today. And Tim, if you want to come up, I can pray for you. Father, thank you for this wonderful, supportive community and this room full of people here with Tim today, who are here because they care about him and want to know what it is he's been working on these last months. So I pray for calm nerves and confidence and peace. And I thank you for the opportunity to have worked with Tim this year. Thank you, and in Jesus' name, amen.
All right, so is this working? Am I good? Like, people can hear me, or should I put it up more?
Eat it.
What?
Closer.
Closer? Is this better?
Okay. All right, worst case scenario, we're good? I don't understand microphone. They scare me. Okay.
Speak great.
All right. Okay, so yeah, Lindsay did a really good job of introducing my topic today. So I'm just wondering, who here has actually read the book Life of Pi? Anybody? Anybody? Okay, who here has seen the movie? First off, I'd like to start by apologizing that happened to you. But it'll do, but the book is always better. So yeah, as Lindsay said, I first encountered this book last summer. I was doing a directed study with Lindsay on new mythology, magical realism, and fantasy fiction, and I had to read this book. And my first thoughts of this book, my first opinions of this book were like, oh, it's on Oprah's book club list. And it was funny because as I was reading it, I listened to this audiobook where this guy with an American accent, like a Southern American drawl, was pretending to be the Canadian narrator who was interviewing an Indian man. So he'd have like his Canadian accent with the American drawl coming in underneath, and then he'd pretend to be Pi with an Indian accent with the American drawl underneath, and it was so funny. It was so good. But when I finished this book, it just absolutely knocked me off my feet. Like, I just remember finishing it last summer and emailing Lindsay and being like, listen, I'm not getting my position paper in tonight. Like, I just need time, because the book just kind of completely took me off guard. Like, I was not expecting it to hit me. In the academic system where it's like, let's read a book and let's read it in 2 days and we're going to discuss it for like 3 hours and I want a 4-page paper on it this week, let's go. You often don't get to encounter books. And the fact that I got to encounter this book really quickly, and yet it still had the power to completely knock me off my feet, suggests that there's something more about it. Suggests that it wasn't just a bland piece of literature, that there was so much more hidden behind it. And so that's really what inspired me to write this paper. So yeah, I'm going to start off by introducing you to Karen Armstrong and her book, A Short History of Myth. It's a little tiny book. I meant to bring it with me, but I forgot it. So just pretend I'm holding a little black book. It's really cute. this book was where I actually was open to the idea of myth as anything other than how I've just grown up understanding it. Myth, we often, like when people think of myth, they think, oh, the Greek pantheon, and we think like Zeus and Hades and all those, mythological figures, which, isn't wrong, but there's so much more to understand about it. For years, the word myth has been synonymized with falsehood, with lies, with deceit. Like when you Google the word like myth, 5 weight loss myths, or like Mythbusters, or like common myths accepted about this historical event. And we often forget that myths aren't actually wrong. Myth, according to Karen Armstrong, is man's way of understanding what cannot be explained in the world around him. So when you think way back to the beginning, we don't understand what the sun is. We can't wrap our mind around the fact that it's a big ball of fire just floating in the sky. So we think of it as this ethereal being, this celestial being that is up there that provides light, heat, and how, the sustenance for life. And when you think about it scientifically now, thousands of years later, that's not actually that far off. Like, that's actually pretty accurate. It provides heat, it provides light, it provides the sustenance for life. But they use myth, and they use their ways of storytelling to try and come to terms with that. Another example, one that Armstrong uses specifically, is like Native Americans and their hunting rituals, which I thought was really interesting. She looks at how there was so much myth surrounding the hunt, which seems to be a very primordial, simple thing, go, stab bear, eat it, done. But she takes it, and she looks at how they surrounded it by myth. The natives identified with these bears. They identified with the deer, At the end of the day, like, humans are large mammals, bears and deer are large mammals. And so they felt it was almost akin to hunting other people. They could relate with them and they felt empathy for them. And so they created myth as a way of coming to grips with that traumatic experience of having to kill another living being. You see it in the way that they use every part of the animal. The bones are used for structure, and the hides are used for clothing or for tents and like those kinds of things, because they have such a deep found respect for those animals and the myth that they've woven around it. And so instead of hunting becoming a traumatic thing, it is this deeply intimate thing. It's this deeply intimate encounter. My parents are here, and they can tell you about when I learned how to fish for the first time. And how I had to go home crying to my mom because I was like, I killed a fish and it was crying, help me, and I didn't know what to do. How to mythologize, and how to act, like encounter those animals the way that the natives learned to encounter those animals. It could have been a really beautiful experience, but instead it was one that I haven't told in years. But yes, so we're going back to the idea that myth is often considered as the opposite of truth. It's often considered the opposite of fact, and this couldn't be more wrong. In the 21st century, all right, we're gonna go a lot more modern now, we've backburnered the arts. We consider the arts to be a secondary thing, a hobby, a pastime. They're just something that, oh, well, if you have time between, your shifts as a doctor, astronaut, lawyer, and space, then yeah, you can write a book. Sure, go for it. Yeah, something I kind of wanted to do to portray what I mean by this is, okay, anybody here who is a liberal arts student, or was a liberal arts student, or considers themselves a writer, painter, artist, musician, any form of art, raise your hand. All right, so out of this group of people, could you put down your hand if you've ever been looked down upon because you're not a science student, a med student, an engineering student, a lawyer, or so forth? Or put them down if, oh, it's just a liberal arts degree, or someone's ever said like, oh, call me when you study something real. If that is just such a prevalent mentality in the modern day. If you look around the room and you see everybody with their hands still held up, that is the percentage of people in this room who have never been belittled as an artist or as a mythologist or as a writer. And I think that's really sad. Going back to Armstrong and the historical study of myth, storytellers way back in the day were revered. Before the written word was a thing, the only way that we had to remember was through painting or through telling stories or reciting epics. You know, like we watched a video last year in one of Agnes's classes of this man who memorized the entirety of Beowulf. Thank you, Jacob. One of us read my notes. He memorized the entirety of Beowulf, which is a huge freaking novel. Like, it's not, you know, it's not a cute little 7-page presentation. It's like, it's a massive piece, and he memorized it because that's what people had to do to remember things and to pass it on to the next generation. And these people, the bards, the storytellers, the painters, the village elders, the memory bearers, were revered and actually held as some of the highest members of society. And when we look at it today, and we look at the amount of people who kept their hands up because they were never, ever underappreciated as an artist, you realize that there's a big change there. You know, we do not hold them in the same light that people used to hundreds of years ago. Yeah, but the thing is that we have to remember that all is not lost in this journey. Something that Jan Martel, the author of Life of Pi, cries out for in his novel is for the world to begin to support its artists and to believe in myths again. And this is something that we can actually do, which I like that. I like when I can do things. New mythology, we used that word a lot before, but now I'm actually going to describe what it is the idea that we can create mythologies for today. Like I said before, the natives created myths to understand, you know, why they had to kill these bears and where they went after they died. Or, you know, all these myths throughout the years to help us understand things. We can still create new myths for today. This isn't an obsolete technology, but rather one that we've just, you know, let sit on the back burner and let grow dust. New mythology are myths that we need to write for the listeners of today. There are things that are supposed to speak to the problems and address the problems that we're currently facing, where it is at, rather than where we would like it to be. And what I mean by that is Jan Martel, throughout his work, isn't looking at the world around him and saying, something is not right. And so he wrote a book and addressed that problem. A thought that arose during the research for this time was, oh, well, if we're going to create new mythologies, then does that get rid of the old mythologies? And that's just something I want to address really quickly before I move on. And the answer is no. New mythologies are not created to replace the older mythologies. We're not replacing them in the way that you go out and you get a new pair of shoes because your old ones are worn out. When we create new mythology, we're looking at our feet and we're saying, okay, what do my feet need right now? Do I need more arch support in my next pair? Do I need more cushioning? What do I need right now? And we're creating a new pair of shoes designed to fit our current feet's needs, but we are still looking to those old pair of shoes because we're not reinventing the wheel. We're not saying, all right, I don't like these shoes anymore, so I'm gonna go get new shoes like nobody's ever seen before. I'm gonna imitate that, and I'm going to look at that and see, what did these shoes do that were right? How can I change them to be more comfortable for what my feet currently need? You know, we're not going to just throw them out and say, all right, let's create a brand new pair of shoes that nobody's ever seen. We're gonna imitate what came before us to create the solution for now. Yes. Here we go. So, new mythology, like I was just saying, does not make old mythology outdated. New mythology is actually the author dialoguing with the old mythology. And what I mean by that is it's the author looking at the old mythology and relating with it. It's him taking his own associations, his own thoughts, his own feelings, his own You know, like everything that anybody's ever said to him, done around him, showed him, anything that he's ever influenced in dialogue with that older mythology. An example I want to use is Homer's Odyssey, which I think most of us are pretty familiar with. And if not, you should read it. It's really good. I really like it. Margaret Atwood, another author who I really love and highly recommend, actually wrote a piece of new mythology directly in response to the Odyssey. She wrote the Penelopiad, which is basically, in the Odyssey, Odysseus is stranded away from home, and so he decides that he's going to try and find his way home. So he builds a ship, and he gets on it, and he says, you know, God, help me, do what you will. And then he takes off, and he's trying to find his way home to his beautiful wife, Penelope. And then every now and again throughout the story, it shifts back and, you know, oh, and this is what Penelope's going through at home, but, you know, really it's more about Telemachus, her child, you know, back to Odysseus. And so Margaret Atwood looked at this, sassy little Canadian author, I love her. And she looks at the Odyssey, and she sees a challenge in her own time. She sees the way that women are sidelined, or the way that women are kind of not ignored, but, you know, backburnered, and they're secondary in her society, in her day and age. And she looks at modern day feminism and she says, all right, how can I dialogue with the Odyssey to create a piece of new mythology for today? And so she wrote the Penelopiad, which is Penelope looking back over her life and over the events of her life, but especially the works of the Odyssey, and seeing that she wasn't just a passive member who sat in the back, you know, I'm just gonna sit here and weave a nice little blanket for my father until Odysseus comes home. You know, she's doing these brilliant things like unraveling it at night so that she has an excuse to keep weaving, and, you know, she shows that like women are strong and women are powerful by dialoguing with this old myth that doesn't immediately seem to be about Penelope at all. And I think that's brilliant. She takes this old myth and she dialogues with it and turns it into something that the modern reader can read, even if they've never read the Odyssey, and relate with and take that to heart, and it makes a huge impact. And like that was only written a few years ago. It's not very old, and there's already like several stage plays. There's a movie happening, I believe, which I'm really excited for. And yeah, so Life of Pi also, whether it's conscious or not, dialogues with the Odyssey. And the reason why I say whether or not it's conscious is because there's an idea that I look at in my thesis that Carl Jung talks about, an idea called the collective unconscious. The collective unconscious is the bank of stories, the bank of thoughts and relationships that man as a society collects together. So lit students, you probably know this as Tolkien's Cauldron of Story, or psych students, you're probably more familiar with Carl Jung's collective unconscious and the study of archetypes. But basically what it is, it's the collection of ideas that we make as a community. So like, if I throw the word mother out there, odds are most people in this room would think maternal, protective, nurturing, like those kinds of words that you associate with it. And that's just a brief example of what the collective unconscious can do among us. But for Life of Pi, I don't know if Jan Martel read the Odyssey and went, I'm gonna respond to this by writing Life of Pi, or if this was just one of the stories that was floating around in the back of his head as part of the collective unconscious. Because one, I haven't met Jan Martel. He looks really scary, so I made a purpose not to. But two, because like I said earlier, when I introduced the Odyssey, I said a lot of the people in this room probably have read it, you know, because we go to school here and you have to read the Odyssey. But also, those who haven't probably know something about it, and that's part of the collective unconscious. We might not necessarily know the story of the Odyssey, but we remember the story of Odysseus fighting the Cyclops, or we know the story of Odysseus trying to sail between the two monsters, or we know those kinds of stories because they're just things that have been passed down through the years. Maybe not under the same name, but under the same spirit, really. So Life of Pi can be seen as a response to the Odyssey. It's really interesting when you look at them, comparing Pi and Odysseus. They're two very wise men experiencing extremely similar journeys, drifting across the ocean, trying to find their way home, left entirely at the mercy of the gods, like seeing the inspiration that goes and intertwines between all of these stories to create, again, Tolkien's idea of the cauldron of story. And then we can see how Pi serves as a form of new mythology by seeing how these stories are different. Because I mean, if we keep telling the same old myths and putting a new lick of paint on it for the purpose of making it look fresh, it's pretty boring. But if you look at Life of Pi as not a new lick of paint over the Odyssey, but you see, oh, he took some inspiration from the Odyssey, but he took some inspiration from his new world and what's around him, around Jan Martel while he's writing, and you look at all the other inspirations, and you look at the difference, you can see how Life of Pi was really written for Jan Martel's society, the world that Jan Martel came from. Odysseus, great journey. Pi, also great journey, but Pi's journey is really more focused on the spiritual side of the journey rather than the physical. And I think that that speaks deeply to what Jan Martel is trying to say through his novel. Pi embraces spirituality. Throughout his journey, he actually was born Hindu, and then he met a Catholic priest and went, whoa, I love this faith. And then he met a Muslim man praying and was like, wow, this is amazing. And he's constantly finding new things and being so inspired by that. Martel, when he was writing this, he sees the spiritual and he sees the artistic lack in the modern world. And so he created this character and created this story, you know, this character who embraces both the artistic and the spiritual, but also the real, the science, the everyday life. And he combines them to try and remind people that we don't have to live just, you know, okay, not spiritual, but just really direct what's happening right here. You know, like I said before, doctor, lawyer, astronaut, you know, or, oh, spiritual monk. You can actually live parts of both. You don't, you know, it's not two separate sides. And I think that that's something that Martel really pushes for, is that it's not two parties. It's not the liberal arts versus the sciences, you know. I lost my spot. But yes, so summarizing this section before I move on, and we're gonna come back because, you know, cyclically coming around. New mythology is the creation of a mythology for the problems in the modern world through dialoguing with the older mythologies, rather than trying to create something new and fresh that's never been done before. All right, so just give me a second. All right, so moving on to part 2, which is magical realism. I love magical realism. I only encountered it last summer for like the first time. Like, I briefly saw it like right at the end of English 2000 and then going into the summer with an entire course on it with Lindsay. Okay, so magical realism. It sounds ridiculous. Magic and real, they don't go together because they're contradictory, really. Realism as a genre is about trying to encapsulate and imitate reality as best as possible. So in a realist story, if somebody with no background on the story was to read it, they wouldn't be able to tell if it was fiction or non-fiction. So like, for example, Victor Hugo's Les Miserables, like, when you Google, like, is Les Mis, like, one of the first things to come up, a real story, because people can't actually tell whether or not it actually happened. For the record, it is fictional, but it's based on actual events. But he weaves, like, realists weave stories that are so real that if you read them, you wouldn't be able to tell if it was fictional or not. And so you're wondering, okay, but how does magic come into this? Because, I mean, I don't know about you, but I don't see magic happening. Magical realism is realism except the author purposefully puts one single drop of magic in there. Just one little element, or sometimes two little elements, if they get really frisky. They put just one or maybe two little drops of magic in there. And when I say magic, I'm not referring to, Harry Potter and witches and wizards and wands. When I say magic, I mean the impossible. I mean the things that you look at and you're like, that is absolutely ridiculous. But for some reason it happened. And this drop of magic goes in, and the purpose of it is to highlight the parts of reality that the author wants to question or to examine closer. And this magic, it can't just be in there for the sake of, oh, I want to be a realist, but I also like to party. It has to be for a purpose. And what I mean by this is if it's like, it's a guy's green. Like, that's ridiculous. It's not magical realism. You just wanted a green sky because you wanted to be different. But magical realists put that little drop of magic in there. Like, maybe the sky is green, but it's for a purpose, and it goes to serve a purpose, and it makes us question, okay, well, if the sky is green in this book, why is the sky blue in my own world? An excellent example of magical realist fiction is actually Kafka's Metamorphosis. I can see all the English or Dalton students in the crowd is like, oh god. We just finished reading that a couple weeks ago. In this story, Gregor Samsa wakes up one morning and discovers that he's been turned into a bug. Like, he just wakes up and he's like, oh dang it, I'm a bug. And he doesn't, he doesn't question it. His first thought isn't, how did this happen, or why am I a bug, or is this even real? His first thought is, dang, how am I supposed to go to work like this? Is what helps it to not be ridiculous. The magic isn't supposed to be questioned. Like when he sees his family, they all freak out because they're like, oh god, our child's been turned into a bug, it's disgusting. Not, our child's been turned into a what the, there it is. He's a bug now, okay. But yes. And so that's why I think magical realism is so interesting, because we're not limited to the bounds of reality. The fact that he can just be like, you know what? Franz Kafka, I'm gonna make my character a bug today, why not? And the fact that he can do that to point out like the familial relationship that goes on and the sense of alienation, the fact that his family sees him turn into a bug and they're like, oh, well, he's practically dead to us now, It's not like, oh, how can we fix it or how can we help? It's like, okay, let's just lock him in a room and eventually he'll starve to death, And that's what it is. He did that to point out the flaws in those relationships or the nature of being alienated or being different in your own home. Kafka didn't go, I'm just gonna make him a bug because you know what, let's be adventurous today. He did that for a point. And so now we come back to Life of Pi and we say, what's the magical within Life of Pi and why is it important? Why is it pointing out, what is it pointing out about our own world? So the magical element within Life of Pi is found in the sheer impossibility of the novel. And what I mean by impossibility, I'm not saying, oh, it's ridiculous, it's just so weird. What I'm saying is, what happened was impossible, it was crazy. The book is divided into 3 sections. Section 1 is just Pi's life story. He tells a story of how he was raised in a zoo and how he came to embrace Islam and Hinduism and Christianity. And for the record, he was raised in a zoo by zookeeper parents, not actually in a zoo. And nothing remotely impossible happens in this section. By the end of section 1, you kind of feel bored because you're like, okay, what's gonna happen next? I mean, nothing's really strange has happened yet. And then section 2 is where things get fun. So Pi's family is moving from India to Canada on a cargo ship full of zoo animals because they're zoo owners. When the boat goes down, Pi realizes that he's stranded on a lifeboat with a tiger, a zebra with a broken leg, a hyena, and an orangutan. And he goes to survive 227 days on a lifeboat with these animals, all of whom could and would literally kill him without batting an eye, you know? Like, they would have just killed him the second they were hungry and realized, oh, I need food, I might as well kill the scrawny Indian kid. And yet, for some reason, he survived. Section 2 is magical because it's absolutely preposterous. He survives 9 months with a tiger who we saw in section 1 would literally just kill him in seconds. Like, we saw it hunt down and kill a goat like that, super fast. But then things just get weirder with the animals. They're actually the most normal part of the boat. He finds an island that turns acidic at night and melts down and eats humans. He stumbled upon a cannibalistic Frenchman. Sorry, a blind cannibalistic Frenchman, because cannibalistic Frenchmen are too normal. And he literally finds flying fish, like fish that are just flying. Like, not the ones that jump out of the water, like literal, like, they're just gonna whiz by because it's a flying fish. And what's actually so interesting about it is the way that Jan Martel weaves this story, and he pulls the story together, is you don't realize that this is strange. Like, as you're going, he slowly submerges you. Like, I'm sure you've all heard the metaphor of boiling frogs, right? You throw a frog into hot water, it's like, oh, the water's hot and it jumps out. If you throw a frog into cold water and you slowly turn the heat up, it's just like, oh yeah, it's just getting a little warm in here. Next thing you know, it's being boiled alive and it doesn't even notice. And that's kind of what Jan Martel does with section 2. It's like, no, the first section is completely realist, and then as it goes, it just starts to slowly get a little weirder, and then like by the end of section 2, we should all logically be going, this is an island and it turns acidic at night and dissolves humans, and the fruits contain human teeth, because that makes no sense. But we don't question it, because he slowly just submerges us into the magical. And so section 3, the final section of the novel, which is actually really short, it's only like 20 odd pages in the like 300-page novel, it begins when Pi lands in Mexico. He was on a life raft after the ship, so we couldn't really aim north to Canada, so he goes to Mexico instead. And when he gets there, he's interrogated by 2 Japanese men, Mr. Chiba and Mr. Akamoto. And they're there because they're trying to find out why the boat sank, because it was a Japanese cargo ship. And so they ask him what happened. And so he tells the story of section 2, which is really, really weird, but you should really read it because it's amazing. And they also think that Pi is absurd. Like, you can see it in the way that they react to him. They just want to know the story that really happened. They just want to know the one of my favorite quotes in the book, as Lindsay knows, the dry, yeastless factuality of what happened. They don't want stories with tigers on boats and cannibalistic Frenchmen. They want the story of what actually happened. And so Pi then goes to tell the story of what actually happened. Instead of the animals, he was stuck on a lifeboat with a savage cook, a sailor with a broken leg, and his mother. The cook cut off the sailor's leg for food and fishing bait. The sailor eventually bleeds out and dies. And then the cook kills Pi's mother viciously in front of him. And then Pi snaps and kills the cook later on. And it's a terrible story. It's really horrible. And if Martel just told that story, we'd all just be like, wow, okay, that's really weird, It's really dark and twisted, honestly. The story is traumatic by nature. And I use the word traumatic purposefully because it kind of reminds us of the natives and the traumatic experience of the hunt and why they mythologize. It leaves no wonder as to why Pi would want to go and adventure into the magical to try and make sense of it. Because it was just such an awful experience for him. It was such a traumatic experience. Magical realism for years was considered to be a genre almost exclusively written by post-colonial authors. Post-colonial, in case you don't already know, is essentially when a colony, such as Great Britain, comes over and says, hey, we like this land, we're gonna colonize it, and they take it over, usually by either forcing the natives into slavery or killing them all, or sometimes both. And so it's very understandable why post-colonial authors would want to go and venture into the world of magical realism. You know, the trauma of having your culture taken from you and being beaten and killed into submission. It's very traumatic. I mean, obviously. The heart of magical realism is not about being post-colonial. I mean, yes, being post-colonial does, you know, create the symptoms of wanting to be a magical realist, but magical realism at its heart is about the oppressed. It's about the marginalized and those who've been pushed aside and forgotten about. Which is why we see so many post-colonial new mythologists. But we also see some people from other settings, like Margaret Atwood, who grew up as, you know, a liberal arts woman in a very sexist and very anti-liberal arts culture. Or we see Jan Martel, who he was born in Spain, but constantly moved around to different countries, so he never had a home and he could never set roots anywhere. His parents were ambassadors, and so they just constantly, like the longest he ever lived anywhere was, I think it was 17 months somewhere, and then took off to another country. Not another town, another country. And so it makes sense then why Pi would want to go and turn to magical realism and myth, because that's a traumatic story, and so he looks at it and he says, how can I come to grips with it, but also how can I find the deeper meaning in it? What I love about Life of Pi is that it's an amazing way that Jan Martel uses magic in order to take a step back from reality and to take a step back from the empiricism and the need for science and the need for proof and look back at reality in order to make some sense of it. I touched on it very briefly before, but like magic and realism don't make sense. I mean, they're almost opposing forces because of the fact that realism, what I can touch, what I can feel, what I can measure, and magic, the impossible, the intangible, the inexplicable, why would they go together? And that's what it is. Magical realists see the reality. They see the problem within the reality, and they say, how can I take a step back from that reality while not leaving it entirely, and look at it in order to make more sense out of it? And what's really interesting is that magical realist fiction, specifically like how they write, it's like Jan Martel says, I see a problem with today's society. I see a problem with how we don't support our authors and how we don't support our artists and how we don't support those who venture out into the unknown enough. And he says, how can I apply my imagination to this to come to a deeper understanding? And how can I take someone else by the hand and say, hey, I'm gonna tell you a story and you're gonna venture off into my imagination? He found, like, magical realists have found a way to show other people exactly how they see things, exactly how they see the world, and they see the problems of this world and how they can solve them. And so, yeah, going back to like my own story, going back to my first experience, it kind of blew me away because of the fact that I love fantasy fiction. I actually took that course because I loved fantasy. I love being able to kind of let go of reality and just go wherever my imagination wants to take me. And what blew me away about Life of Pi was the fact that he could let go of reality and drift away but still be anchored to reality, you know? The fact that he could take a step back from reality without leaving it all together and look back at it in a way that makes it so much more relatable and so much more open to people who can't escape reality. And that is the entire dialogue between Pi and the Japanese men, because they can't see myth, they only see reality. And so Pi tells a magical realist story because it's realistic enough that we can understand it and we can relate it to our own experience, but it's just foreign enough that it makes us have to challenge what it is that we've accepted. And so, yeah, that is why I wrote about Life of Pi. So.
Okay. So now we have 15-ish minutes for questions. Anyone have thoughts or questions to ask him? Words of encouragement?
Weeping and gnashing of teeth. Walter?
So the dry yeastless version, what do you think Martel might want us to doubt about that version? That was a question I remember from reading the story myself.
Just take a moment to think. Sometimes I start talking and oh, there we go. I don't think that Martel wants us to doubt that story. And what I mean by that is Martel, that happened in the story. Like within the realm of Life of Pi, he went on the lifeboat and that happened and his mother got savagely killed in front of him and all these horrible things happened. And we're not supposed to doubt that. Martel isn't saying, let's turn a blind eye to reality and just venture off into fields of magic and playing with animals on boats. What he's saying is, let's look at it and let's accept it because it happened, but let's also try to find a way that we can creatively understand it to come to new meaning and to come to deeper meaning about it, you know? Like, if Pi just told the two Japanese men the story straight up of what actually happened, like that's really depressing and that's really sad. And not to say, okay, so we're gonna tell magical realist stories so our lives aren't really sad, but rather, let's tell magical realist stories because let's look at what we can learn from it and let's see how we can come to terms with it. So it's not that he wants us to doubt the real so much as he wants us to take a step back from it so we can look at it in more of a bigger picture rather than just this one little event that I was a part of. Does that make sense? Okay, cool.
Can I ask a question?
I've just made them speechless, I think. Yes.
I'm gonna ask a question.
Go for it.
Then, can you talk a little bit about how you incorporated Bakhtin in the third chapter?
Oh, yes. Mikhail Bakhtin. Okay, so.
Kevin and Jacob.
Yeah, I can see the lit theory students like, where? Okay, so Mikhail Bakhtin, for those of you who do not know, which is probably every one of you except for the lit students, he was a Russian philosopher back during the era of the Russian Empire and then later the Soviet Union. There was a movement at the time called Russian formalism, which was basically the idea of the validity of older forms of literature, poetry, plays, philosophy, those kinds of things that can be taken and understood in one way, that can be taken and understood because this is the one meaning that we can get out of this poem. And so the novel, which was actually a relatively new form of writing at the time, and when I say new, I mean like it, you know, we don't have Homer's novels, you know, we have the more recent ones. Bakhtin argued that the novel was an equally valid form of writing, and so he found literary devices such as dialogism or the carnivalesque and all of these ideas to help look at the novel and understand why the novel is just as valid or just as viable of a method of literature as any other form. So chapter 3 of my thesis is actually going back and looking through the importance of new mythology and magical realism and how it stands in Life of Pi, but through the eyes of Bakhtin and his findings. Yeah. Is that good? Is there anything else I can?
The thing with Bakhtin's ideas is that they are resolutely historical, social, they're very embodied. They're lived out in community as we work together to create meaning, so it ties into the idea of the collective unconscious type of stream of thought. So it talks about, you talk about dialogism.
Yes, can I? Yes. Sorry. Okay, so I love the idea of dialogism. I don't know if it's dialogism or dialogism. I don't know. I just read it in a book, and it's Bakhtin, so he probably said it in Russian anyways. But dialogism is the idea that a piece of writing isn't just, it's not like, oh, this is my piece of paper and it says exactly what it wants to say. Dialogism is the idea, like I talked about it before, new mythologies created when an author dialogues with the older mythologies because they're coming with their own understanding of the world. But what's interesting is dialogism, it's not just about the author dialoguing, but it's about the characters within the novel dialoguing with each other and the different ideas in the novel dialoguing, but also when the reader dialogues with it, I read Life of Pi and I see new mythology and I see magical realism because that's how my own learning and my own experience relate with the novel, but then somebody else could read it who comes from a different background, and the way that their own life dialogues with it could be something completely different. And so I think it's really interesting because Bakhtin's idea of dialogism it heightens the dignity of literature. Instead of literature just being, this is the notes that Tim wrote and that's it, they're never gonna live or do anything, to whoever reads these is going to breathe new life into it and come to it with their own understanding, which I think is really amazing and so unique, You write it and you publish it and you send it out there, and then whoever experiences it breathes new life into it or witnesses new experience within it. So yeah, I kind of forgot to mention it.
I gave you that scary 5-minute warning hand and you
She did.
into an operation.
You're obviously impressed by this genre. What might you do with this type of literature?
Sorry, I've been thinking so much about my thesis that I kind of forgot after this presentation. I don't just cease to exist. I can. I'm not really sure how I would relate with it. And what I mean by that is, I'll be very honest in saying that, I've had a very blessed life in terms of, being from, a family that could put food on the table and being from a first world country and all these things. And so, really, magical realism, like I said, is a lot about the oppressed and about giving voice to those who've had their voices taken from them. And I myself haven't really had that happen. And that's been an amazing blessing, and I'm very grateful for that. But yeah, I'm not really sure if I could be a magical realist myself, but I have a massive respect for those who can, because there's just such a strength in willing to write literature about it rather than accepting defeat. So yeah, I can't really see myself as a magical realist. I'm still a fantasy man myself, but I just have such a huge respect for them. So yeah.
Thank you.
I think John had his hand up first, and I'm still looking at
Yeah, so I have a comment and a question, really. So first off, I really appreciate this talk, just because when I heard once that J.R.R. Tolkien wanted to create a new mythology for people through his work, it made no sense to me. It was like, okay, how is that similar to old mythologies? Because these people actually believed it, right? These gods existed to them, and so on. But through this talk, I've come to understand that it has to do with this literary device response to the traumatic nature of experience itself, right? So this is very profound, I think, an understanding. But so my question to you though is, with new mythology, is it as if I don't know how I want to compare the two, but as I just noted, those old mythologies were real to the people who experienced them. Zeus was a real agency, right? How do you think a new mythology can be as effective, you know, like to people who don't see it as like the fabric through which they experience?
Darn it, I was doing so good up till now.
I'm sorry, I was kind of stewing on that for a bit.
No, that's great. I love that you're stewing on it because that means that you yourself are having an internal dialogue with what I'm saying. I think, I'm trying to think how to come to this. It's hard because I'm also a history student, so I'm like, I'm gonna come to this from a history side, but this is a literary presentation.
You can be a history student if you want. Right, Rebecca?
I'm trying to think of the thing is, I don't think that new mythology is necessarily, and the idea of mythology is necessarily dependent upon actuality. I think that I talk about new mythology and magical realism, which is really hard because as I'm talking, I'm trying to weave them together, but they're not like necessarily lenient upon each other. And what I mean by that is like ignoring magical realism, and we're just talking about new mythology here. I think that the degree with which they believe it actually happened doesn't necessarily change the potency of mythology. And what I mean by that is like in light of Karen Armstrong's writings, I mean we can see the stories of the gospel as mythology. And again, myth isn't synonymous with didn't happen or is made up or is fake, but is rather about the fact that it's a living and breathing story that can have new life breathed into it as time goes. And so I think that would kind of be, like all I can really say on that is, it's not, like, the power of myth is not dependent upon actuality.
I think just as the key mechanism to me understanding this, because I think that magical realism, the way that you explained it through Life of Pi, was kind of like the contrast between the fake story and the real one was like, is this more real? Like I needed this to understand this, to kind of process this. And so that was actually like a very apt illustration of how mythology is effective, right? Like why literature and these literary texts are important for understanding experience. But anyway, sorry, that was a hard question to answer because I don't think it's really answerable. Like in the sense, sorry, you answered it well. I didn't know what I was going for.
You were talking about magical realism in particular as being a helpful tool for people who've undergone forms of oppression, maybe abuse or traumatic experiences. Do you see it as being useful, even if you can only write it from the point of view of having experienced those things? What would the reading of it do for the oppressors?
I like that idea, honestly. I have to process it, actually. I feel like I need a bit of time to chew on that one too, because I feel like I don't feel like I have been an oppressor, and if I have, I'm really sorry that I'm completely ignorant to it. I think that's interesting, honestly, because I feel like experiencing Life of Pi and how the proverbial oppressor is the mentality of just relying solely on factuality and just on what's actually happened and what can be seen through science, and that, like, I myself, like, I'm not that kind of person who processes just through what I can see and what I can experience. Like, I am, like, of spiritual nature, but I found that myself, I was knocked off my feet by this book because it kind of made me, like, encounter that little part of myself. That little part of me is like, yeah, God, I believe in you, but if you could prove it, that'd be great, you know? It actually kind of made me have to. So I wouldn't say, like, I'm a full-blown oppressor in terms of his own, where Martel is coming from, but it did make me encounter that little part of myself that is. And so when it comes to other oppressors, such as the Penelopiad and, you know, like sexism or Native Americans and, you know, like the modern white culture. Like, I'm not really sure because I simply just can't really encounter that myself. But yeah, I think it makes you have to take a step back and realize, but what it does from there, sorry, I can't tell.
Stephanie had a question, then Agnes, and then Matt if we have time.
Okay, great. Speak now.
Mine's also more of just a comment, just saying, I like the way you explain magical realism because I didn't have an understanding of it at all before. And I really love literature, so I read literature, and I connect to literature, like Margaret Atwood, for example. And I look for that in literature because of, like, I come from a very oppressed, like, childhood, and I'm a psych major, so I look at everything in a psych terms, but, like, by reading stories that are, like, have magical realism in them, it helps me connect with my story, to tell my story, to feel more comfortable telling the story, and I feel like it helps me just, like, connect with that story or any traumas that I've faced in a way that I wouldn't be able to without the magical side of magical realism, because it separates it makes it less personal, and it helps me, like, it just helps me connect with it more. And I find that, like, as someone who has been suffered from depression, I'm sure I've been an oppressor, I know I have, I've been a bully a time or two, and it's helped me see other people's side and see my mistakes in life, but, like, and that's why I love magical realism, and I love the way that you explained it, and I'm gonna go think about it and read my new book that has magical realism. So, thanks, I think it was great, and it brought up that for me.
Agnes.
I had a question, but the conversation after of the last 2 or 3 people has really opened up the whole idea that, okay, so my question was, is it kind of pigeonholing to say all magic realism is written by people who have had a keen sense of being oppressed? And so that was my question, but then the people who spoke after Anna's question, I think really opened up that pigeonhole. So it's not a pigeonhole anymore.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yes, and
Because
I think
so it's not like this very black and white, here's the oppressor and here's the oppressed, but it can be like how you were raised, or it could be a way you've always thought about the world or a certain thing that is really kind of an oppressive way of thinking or seeing the world. So yeah, the people who spoke after Anna really opened it up.
Yeah, and I think everybody's version and everybody's understanding of oppression is different. You know, because for example, Margaret Atwood, who comes from a perspective of being a woman in the academic circle in the late 1900s, versus Martel, who came from a Have family, who were like well-off Canadian citizens who just happened to be traveling the world. You know, like everybody's oppression looks differently. Like not every one of us is a native who had, you know, the British come over and take our land, you know, and so that's I think the challenge is seeing, yeah, that oppression isn't the same for everybody, so.
Matt, did you have something to say, and that would be our last one.
Yeah, I just like, you know, Anna's comment really made me think about whether you could tie in the magical, the experience that's being expressed through the magical realism into a sort of mythology that you don't really understand unless you've been, like an oppressor reading it would not see the signs. So Margaret Atwood's colleagues reading her work would not get what she's saying because that's not their world. They haven't lived through that. So it's sort of maybe a code, a myth for those that, you know, are in a similar circumstance for her. But anyhow.
And I think that's the challenge, is that not all oppressors are going to get it. Not all oppressors in that situation are going to understand, you know, kind of like the story of Moses and Pharaoh, right? Like, if your heart is that hard, yeah, you're not gonna get it. But then for the few of us who, like, don't realize it but are the oppressor or have little oppressor-like tendencies. So, like, for myself, like I said, I'm not an empiricist at all. Like, I am very spiritual and faithful. But there is that little part of me that's like, oh God, I believe in you, but if you could prove it, I wouldn't complain, you know? And that was, just that little tiny part in the back of my heart was what got encountered in this book. And so I feel like it's not truly fair to say 100% of oppressors can't identify with what's going on. But I feel like those who are soft of heart enough and are open-minded enough to be exhorted and called higher to do better actually really can be encountered. And it's just really, it's not so much about the power of the book or the story itself, but it's more about the openness of the reader and whether or not they're actually willing to encounter the literature itself that allows them to be impacted by it. Is that?
Eddie's promises this will
I
be.
just, I really want to thank you for this, Jim. You have a real gift for weaving big ideas together and making them plain. And plain not in an uncomplicated way, but in an everyday way that really makes sense. So thank you. You have a real gift for teaching.
Thank you. And that's from the Dean of History, so I'll take it. English, sorry.